In Magic the Gathering, typically when one thinks of cards that are hard to cast, they think of cards that have really high mana values, or perhaps cards that cost 1 mana of each color. However, there's another group of hard to cast cards that I think often gets overlooked, cards that demand tons of mana that has to be from a single color. Cards that demand 4 or more mana of a single color are incredibly challenging to play in decks that aren't super focused on a single color, as even having one land in play that doesn't produce mana of that color means you're going to have to wait a lot longer to cast it. However, the good news is, when cards have this kind of challenging mana cost, they tend to give you pretty amazing rewards for pledging yourself so intensely to a single color. They also tend to do things that are quintessentially of their color, which makes sense because they ask you to go so hard into their color. In this MTG Top 10, I'm going to look at cards that cost 4 or more mana of a single color to cast. We're going with the most monocolor intensive cards possible too, as I chose to restrict the list to cards that only cost colored mana. In other words, cards that also cost generic mana, like Mind Over Matter, weren't eligible for this list. If you are interested in a video that looks at cards that cost 4+ mana of the same color, that also might require some additional mana, I've already done that top 10, although I probably should update it at some point in the future. Alright, let's take a look at the 10 cards that cost 4 or more mana of the same color that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours. And a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Nefarious Lich. A callback to the alpha card simply called Lich, Nefarious Lich costs 4 black mana for an enchantment that really turns the way the game works on its head. If damage would be dealt to you, you exile that many cards from your graveyard instead, and if you can't, you lose the game. And if you would gain life, you draw that many cards instead, and when this enchantment leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. So it makes your life total meaningless, effectively turning your graveyard into your life total, and you can even draw cards should you gain life. This is definitely tough to make work, but if you can load your graveyard with lots of cards, and you're good at gaining life, it can offer some serious upside, although the fact that your opponent can simply destroy it and make you lose the game isn't so good. But it is a very black card since it does something super powerful, but also super costly. It's hard for a card that is this strange to see any widespread success, but it did achieve a single top 8 in Standard. The deck it was in looked to combine Overgrown Estate and Sickening Dreams with it for a combo kill. The Estate could allow you to sacrifice lands to gain 3 life, and with Nefarious Lich in play, that means you're casting Ancestral Recall. And once you had enough cards in hand, you could cast Sickening Dreams and discard all of them to do X damage to each creature and each player. Because your graveyard would be filled with sacrificed lands and all the cards you discarded, you would then exile your graveyard, but your opponent wouldn't have that luxury. They would just be dead. That deck only achieved that single top 8 though, so this is in very serious danger of getting bumped off the list in the future. At number 9, it's Primalcrux. For 6 green mana, it's a star with trample, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of green mana symbols in the mana costs of permanents you control. What's more green than a giant trampling creature that loves green? Chroma was a lot like Devotion, especially on Primalcrux, but it's a different ability word because all the cards with it do a broader number of things than Devotion does, like look at the number of mana symbols in your hand or graveyard to determine an effect. Anyway, the important thing here is that Primalcrux's super color intensive mana cost helps it out, since it means it'll be a 6/6 trampler at worst, and if you have any other green mana symbols around, and you probably do, it can be even more massive. Primalcrux's top 8s both came in Legacy Elf decks, which had no problem having a ton of green mana symbols on the elves they had in play. Giving one elf up with natural order to grab Primalcrux usually meant your opponent would be dead on the next turn. Of course, this was all before the printing of Craterhoof Behemoth, which ultimately became the elf win condition of choice, and it's way better since it wins the turn you grab it instead of needing you to wait for a turn. As such, Primalcrux doesn't have any top 8 since 2008. At number 8, it's Dawn Elemental. For 4 white mana, it's a 3/3 flyer that prevents all damage that would be dealt to it. Damage prevention is a quintessentially white effect, and Dawn Elemental has the most powerful version of it around. The Elemental is virtually impossible to take down in combat, and damage-based removal can't deal with it either, and that's pretty nice on a 4 mana 3/3 flyer, especially in the right metagame. That right metagame was the legacy of 2008, where the best decks in the format were more on the aggressive end, especially Goblin decks, which had very little removal that could deal with the Elemental. These decks even ran Pariah, an aura which redirects all damage that would be dealt to you to a creature you control. In other words, you could never die to damage if you got this combo online, and Goblin decks don't typically have another way to win the game. Dawn Elemental doesn't have any top 8s though since 2008. At number 7, it's Khalni Hydra. It costs 8 green mana for an 8/8 Trampler, but it costs 1 green mana less for each green creature you control. So obviously this is tough to cast if your board's empty, but if you can reduce the cost on this effectively, it can be pretty darn scary, since it'll come down well before you get to 8 mana. While in Standard, it was played in mono-green ramp decks where your Llanowar Elves, Lotus Cobras, and Birds of Paradise all could help you get the Hydra down super early, especially since each of them could effectively contribute 2 mana at a time. It's also seen occasional play in Modern Devotion to Green decks, which play a lot of mana elves, and if you do get the Hydra down, it helps you produce even more insane mana using Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, as there is quite literally no card in the game that can give you more devotion than Khalni Hydra can. However, Khalni Hydra doesn't have any top 8 since 2017. At number 6, it's Elemental Appeal. For 4 red mana, it's a sorcery with Kicker for 5 generic. It creates a 7/1 elemental creature with trample and haste that gets exiled at the beginning of the next end step. If it was kicked, that creature gets +7/+0 until end of turn. Red likes to do lots of damage for very little mana, even at the cost of hurting themselves in the long run, and that's what the appeal is all about. Its top 8s all came in red deck wins in the Standard of 2010 and 2011. This variant of the deck was more adept at producing mana than most, largely thanks to Koth of the Hammer, who could produce tons of red mana. And Elemental Appeal often worked as a game-ending burn spell. Kicking it wasn't even out of the question. However, Elemental Appeal doesn't have any top 8 since 2011. I just talked about Elemental Appeal, so I think it's a good time for me to make an appeal to you. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I could really use your help. At number 5, it's Gigantosaurus. It's a vanilla 10/10 for 5 green mana. Gigantosaurus has been played in both Pioneer and Explorer Devotion to Green decks, where it's a great way to get your devotion up even in the relatively early game, and with mana elves, slamming the Gigantosaurus on turn 3 is very doable. It's also been played in standard Sarkhan's Unsealing decks. Unsealing gives you an absurd payoff for playing creatures with power 7 or greater. It does 4 damage to your opponent and all of their creatures, and Gigantosaurus is one of the best ways to trigger that in the early game, and if you did, it usually meant the game was over. However, like the other cards we've looked at so far, Gigantosaurus is now inactive with its last top 8 coming in 2019. At number 4, it's Doomsday Excruciator. For 6 black mana, it's a 6/6 flyer, and when it enters, if it was cast, each player exiles all but the bottom 6 cards of their library face down. In other words, it's pretty true to its name, as it gives both players a Doomsday-like effect. Additionally, at the beginning of your upkeep you draw a card. Drawing an extra card every turn when you have a huge flyer in play is pretty good, but you better win the game quickly, since you're going to draw those remaining 6 cards in 3 turns. The good news is that a 6/6 flyer, if left unchecked, can definitely do the job. All of the Excruciator's top 8s have come in Standard, where it appeared in Dimir control decks with a hefty demon sub-theme, thanks to Unholy Annex, a powerful card draw enchantment that also drains life if you control a demon. The Excruciator was well worth the downside in the deck, but it could also turn the downside into upside because Jace Perfected Mind made it very easy for you to mill your opponent after the Excruciator shrinks their library. The most recent versions of the deck also implemented Stock Up. It lets you look at your top 5 cards and put 2 of them in your hand while choosing 3 to go in the bottom of your library. Once you do that, it really will feel like Doomsday when you cast the Excruciator, since you will have made sure to put Jace on the bottom of your library. Bad news is, Jace rotated out of Standard earlier this year, and since then, the Excruciator has stopped seeing play in Unholy Annex decks, so it may be done putting up top 8s. At number 3, it's Phyrexian Vindicator. It's a strictly better Dawn Elemental because it has the same mana cost of 4 white mana, and it prevents all damage that would be dealt to it, just like the Dawn Elemental does, but it also lets you redirect that damage to any target. On top of that, it's also bigger than Dawn Elemental as a 5/5. So it presents all the same problems as the Elemental, but is much, much scarier. While in Standard, it showed up in some white We Need X as a top curve threat, and was also often a sideboard card in white control decks, one that could be brought in against aggro decks that had no way of removing creatures other than damage. Against them, the Vindicator was often just game over. It's also appeared a little bit in Pioneer White Weenie, but so far in 2025, it doesn't have any top 8s. At number 2, it's Demilich. For 4 blue mana, it's a 4/3 that costs 1 blue less to cast for each instant and sorcery spell you cast that turn. When it attacks, you exile up to 1 instant or sorcery card from your graveyard and copy it, then cast the copy. Demilich can also be cast from the graveyard if you exile 4 instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard, in addition to paying its other costs. So it's very blue to be into instants and sorceries, and Demilich can even be free if you cast enough of them, whether you're casting it from the graveyard or from your hand. It's nice that if you cast 4 instants or sorceries in a turn with the Demilich in your graveyard, you can definitely cast it, since you'll have the 4 requisite spells. Once in play, he starts copying spells on every one of his attacks, which is a very serious problem for your opponent. This kind of card is always difficult to use in Standard, where there just aren't enough good, cheap spells for it to really take off, but Demilich has excelled in other formats with larger card pools, like Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy. Unsurprisingly, Demilich has been played in spell decks that like the graveyard in all 3 formats, where it's virtually always played alongside Arclight Phoenix. The Phoenix can come back from the graveyard for free if you cast 3 spells in a turn, which also means Demilich can very likely return 2, presenting your opponent with some nasty threats on top of all the value you got by casting a bunch of spells in a single turn. Demilich is still putting up top 8s, especially in Pioneer, and it has the potential to one day be the number 1 card on the list. For now though, that card is Phyrexian Obliterator, the card which the Phyrexian Vindicator we saw earlier is a callback to, and the Obliterator is itself a callback to Phyrexian Negator, a card that was amazing in its heyday. I actually have a whole video about that card if you're interested. Anyway, the Obliterator is 4 black mana for a 5/5 Trampler, and when a source deals damage to the Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. So it may not prevent the damage the same way the Vindicator does, but it does punish your opponent for doing damage in a massive way. After all, it takes at least 5 damage to take it down, and that means giving up 5 permanents. Tangling with this thing in combat is a losing proposition, and many removal spells are too, although it does still go down to straight up destroy or exile effects. After being originally printed in 2011, it found its way into mono black decks in Standard, Modern, and Legacy, sometimes in the main deck and other times in the sideboard, since it wasn't all that good against opponents with enough destroy and exile effects. After being reprinted in 2023's Phyrexia All Will Be One, it once again found its way into Standard, typically appearing in the sideboard of Dimir Control and in the main deck of Golgari Aggro. In the latter, you could combine it with Bushwhack quite effectively. Not only can Bushwhack make sure you get your 4 black sources of mana, when you use it as a fight effect, it's absolutely devastating when you use your Obliterator to do the fighting, since the controller of the source of damage is technically your opponent, even though you're the one making their creature fight. However, the Obliterator has rotated out of Standard once more, and unlike Demilich, it isn't currently active anywhere, so it may lose its spot on this list in the long run. So those are Magic's best cards that cost 4+ mana of a single color. Do you like playing cards with lots of monocolored pips? If so, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on over 900 other MTG top 10s, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.